Hello, everyone. I'm here today to talk about some patterns for developing with Django and HTMX. The inspiration for this talk was because there's a lot of tutorials and guides online, but there's not a lot of code snippets, production-based examples. So this talk tries to give a bit of an insight of my experience in the last few years. We can start with that. My name is Lucas. I'm from Porto, Portugal. I currently work at CheckSec maintaining some Django applications. I've been working with Django for more than 5 years and 3 years with HTMX. Besides my full-time work, I also develop some freelance applications for small companies built using Django and HTMX. They've been a one developer job and always worked flawlessly with this stack. So first, why did I embrace HTMX? So 3 points. The simplicity. I've always worked at companies with small teams. Those teams usually need to look at the entire scope of the application. And even if you bring a simple single-page application with React Angular, it's going to bring a lot of complexity to the global project. Next, because I think most of you like Django or love Django. Django includes all the features you need to build a complete app. But in modern days, you usually need a bit more. Building an SPA means that you need to take part of your time to use other tools that might not be such good as Django. For example, using Django Forms, you're basically building an SPA, might not use it as much, or templates, for example. And finally, productivity. HTMX allows me to ship features and applications faster, do proof of concept for higher management, iterate much faster than having a split backend and frontend, because I need to ask the front-end team to build the interface, while using HTMX, I can control both the business logic and also the presentation layer. Another benefit is because I'm dealing with HTML directly, I can prototype various interfaces without using Figma or other design tools. So first, let's look at what HTMX brings to the Django developer experience. For my point of view, HTMX can be used to provide the small UX/UI improvements to a regular MPA, or you can implement the look and feel of a single-page application without the need of a single-page application framework such as React, Angular, Svelte. So that's basically the focus of maybe some of you already heard of Hypermedia-driven applications. You try to maintain the most state on the server, and the API usually delivers both operations and data at the same time using HTML. So here's a quick example of what kind of differences they have between single-page applications and Hypermedia applications. Single-page applications usually need to maintain states on the business side and the UI. The API usually is serialized. JSON only provides data. They are great for high interactivity because you control everything on the client, but you require a serialization layer, which it's an extra step. An HDA usually maintains the business logic on the server. UI is maintained by simple JS libraries such as Alpine or HTML, and you provide with each request both the data and operations inside the response. And of course, doesn't require serialization because it goes directly from the ORM to the templates. So here we are going to look at most of the sections of a Django application. The models maybe not so important for HTMX development, so we'll focus more on views and templates. So starting with the views, a good pattern is to create views as on-demand entities. So basically, you load partials directly on the HTML. There are several blog posts and tutorials calling this pattern lazy loading, trigger on load. But the idea here is that you build endpoints with separate sections, partials, and you load them directly on the HTML. So for example, the usage here is that you do hx target this, hx trigger load, and you will load the endpoints directly on that HTML element. So we have here an example. We have a section that loads the list of projects. The list of projects will only fetch the necessary UI for that. And that way you can have multiple UI sections just by duplicating that HTML section. Your code is isolated. In this case, this is a project list, so the responsibility and the business logic of listing the projects will always be respected because you're just loading that view with that section. So here's the example. Basically, the idea is to build your views so that you only load the necessary HTML to display it. But how would you build a complex page? This is a good example. We have a dashboard where we want to display the latest project from a customer, the stats of the customer, and the project list. Instead of building partials and combining them into a single view, each view is loaded directly on the HTML, and each section has its own business logic, so it won't break unless you modify them internally. Okay, so here is an example. The main dashboard will just load each partial as the page is rendered. So basically you have independent endpoints instead of building a view that reacts to actions in partials. Each section will have its own responsibility, its own business logic, and you can replicate it easily along your application just by repeating those sections. But you can use div or anything else. This is a 30-minute build example of how it would look. Very simple, not very pretty. But each card is loaded by a separate endpoint. So each endpoint has its own responsibility, and you can use it alongside the app without any problem. Next, I like to favor class-based views over function-based views, especially because you have a lot of boilerplate code on the internal mixins of Django. So context mixin, single object mixin, that you can compose and create views suited for your project. Also, because they are internals of Django, it's easy to spread the information, it's easy to spread knowledge between team members. And if used correctly, by knowing how they work, it can give you huge productivity boosts by removing boilerplate. Building custom mixins from the ground up can be also useful for permission checking that you can spread between all your views, context injection, and other types of common actions. So use a lot of composition on class-based views. At the same time, CRUD is a simple operation when used with HTMX because you can do delete actions in a form or an anchor. So it works like a DRF view set. You can build your own CRUD view, or you can use an external package such as Neapolitan. So next, let's look at some templating tips. HTMX pairs very well with component-driven design. So the idea here is not only to use partials, but components. So components can be unitary and reusable self-contained elements, very simple elements that you can repeat alongside your app, product item, table, toasts, paginators. Using components usually makes templates easier to read, allows you to replicate partials, or in this case components, very easily. And there are a lot of packages that address this limitation. Partials. We can think of partials as composed UI sections. So sections that have other partials or other components, such as a profile menu, a related products sidebar, action sidebar. So it's basically a type of UI that you can aggregate and give it semantic value. Right now there are a lot of component packages. There's Cotton, Slippers, Django components. Django 5.2 also introduced the simple block tag. My go-to option right now is Django Cotton because it uses a very similar field to HTML, so it blends right into your templates. It supports a lot of features that the regular include tag doesn't. So you can pass a lot of complex objects. You can have multiple named slots. And you can even do dynamic component inclusion. So if you have a variable that translates to a component name, you can dynamically introduce it. That's good to build like custom fields, forms with custom fields, where you don't know beforehand what type of fields are you going to render on the template. Next, after we have a solution for the lack of components, we can look at the structure. Having a well-maintained structure is a good advice. Helps consistency, standardizes styling, and maximizes reusability. A good way of having a good structure, I would say, is to have a two-tiered component structure, a bit similar to how generic views work, where you have generic components, such as a table or a menu or a toast. They have a layout template where you can fill slots with specific data models or specific data use cases that are filled by specific components, where you can create them as is or extend from the base components and create a component for a specific use case, data model, etc. Examples are the user table, the error toast, etc. But maybe that's easier by looking at this example. This could be a generic component where you customize the table as you see fit. You describe the slots you want to fill, and a concrete or specific component will be a table bound to a data model, in this case, a project table. This is the result. Here we can see a good way to determine what can be partials on your application and what can be components. If you look at your UI and you have the smallest components that are repeatable, usually the leaves here on the graph, should be components, and all the others should be partials. So next, we can look at some tips to improve HTMX inside your Django code base. Try to use the closest attribute. The closest attribute swaps the most close parent that you specify. This is useful for if you have, for example, a delete button on a table and you want to swap the entire table. It's easier to do closest table and it's more clean than doing something like specific ID, because a specific ID can be errored. And having a syntax like this is more generalized and less error prone. Next is an obvious one, but always try to provide feedback to the user. So use Ajax indicator, display page transitions to show that requests are in flight, display errors by overriding the HTMX response error JavaScript event. That's easily achieved by just displaying a modal saying that there was a request error. And finally, use tooling design to improve developer experience. So use Django HTMX. It's a great package to streamline your HTMX usage inside Django. And as stated before, use component and partial packages to overcome limitations on templates. Next, we can look at some ways of maintaining the state in sync, since when developing with Django and HTMX, you need to address state management on the server. It can be a bit trickier because you need a different mindset than from building apps with front-end frameworks. So a very common pattern is to have multiple partials with independent states. And certain user actions or operations can translate into actions that, or in this case, states that affect multiple UI sections, not only the one that you swapped. So looking at a very simple example, if we submit a form that edits the product's name and we only swap the form, we're going to get stale states on the list because we changed the product name, but the list on the side didn't have any way to know that you changed the product name. So basically this creates a state dependency. There are a lot of ways to approach this. I'm going to present some, but feel free to add. The first and more simple one is to just extend the swap area, so we'll swap both the list and the form. This is useful if you have closely related partials, if you can deduce or calculate easily the context of the other partial, or you can load it on demand. You can also add the business logic of the list context into the edit view, but that breaks the single responsibility, so you want each partial to be fed by different endpoints, so not giving more than one feature, in this case function, to the same endpoint. The second option is to use out-of-band swaps. So for those who don't know, out-of-band swaps is an HTMX feature that allows you to target different DOM elements in the same response. It's useful when you have partials that are not related, and you can easily deduce the dependencies on their context. Finally, there's the option of dispatching an event to other partials. This is a bit trickier because it requires you to implement event management, but it's good when you have complex dependencies and a lot of unrelated partials. Next, we can look at some ways of improving HTML templates. Try and use semantic HTML tags. Those tags are easy to target or swap instead of having complex naming, using tags such as header, a footer, aside, etc. It's easier to target those than have complex naming. Use the dataset property and data attributes to store information on your HTML. Favor web APIs over JavaScript libraries. It's just adding another layer of complexity. And like the semantic HTML, try to use modern HTML elements for small UI instead of relying on JavaScript libraries. So for example, dialog, instead of adding a bootstrap modal, details, input type search, it gives some small UI improvements that can be beneficial. Next will be to know how your client-side interactivity should be presented on the template. So try to avoid inline scripting. Use low overhead frameworks, in this case libraries such as Alpine.js and Hyperscript. When using external JS libraries, wrap them in a declarative way so your templates maintain consistency. And when using very high interactivity or reactivity, move them to a custom Alpine directive or abstract them using proper tooling. This means implementing a web component using React, Svelte, Angular, that you just can drop inside the template, and it reduces a lot of verbosity and helps maintaining the template easy. Once again, scale your interactivity. So low interactivity, Alpine statements, medium interactivity, custom directives, and finally, high interactivity, scale it to web components. This is a bit of a correlation with the balance between two points, the locality of behavior and separation of concerns. HTMX tries to favor a lot of locality of behavior, but a lot of the times in complex projects, it cannot be the best option. It needs to be a balance between those. So we favor locality of behavior by reducing verbosity on complex elements, complex state management, complex data. We try to maintain the most functionality possible without requiring multiple files. But at the same time, we try to favor separation of concerns by moving complex interactivity that's not easily apparent on the file to a different file. Not if the Alpine.js statements scale, move them to its own declarative custom directive. And if you really need a lot of state management, client-side state management, migrate it to a proper tool like an SPA framework and export it as a web component. So, is HTMX a good fit for your project? I think so. Most cases, yes. If you have a very CRUD-heavy application, you don't need a lot of complex business logic on the client side, but you have on the server side, that's no issue. And you don't need a lot of DOM manipulation, it's perfect. But if you need real-time collaboration, a lot of JS libraries, offline functionality, and heavy client-side state, it may not be the best platform to work on. But you can still use it. You can use a hybrid approach where you limit certain scopes of your application into islands and you build them using a web component and you communicate via JSON API or REST API. This is very similar to front-end islands in the front-end realm. You build the entire app using HTMX and limit certain pages to use or load the view into a framework, a front-end framework. And you can also use polling and server-side events with HTMX to build more interactive UIs. So finally, what does HTMX can bring together with Django? You can use other similar ideas with Django. There's DataStar, Django Unicorn, and OnPoly, and they work very well with Django. Try to use View Transitions API. That's a recent API that allows you to make SPA transitions without CSS just by enabling configuration, and all the swaps with HTMX will have transitions. If you need some kind of heavy state swapping, the Ajax Preserve True option, it's a very recent addition, allows complex elements to be moved along the DOM without losing state. So if you have a YouTube video and you try to move it with this option on, it will move the video and continue playing where it was, while before it wouldn't. It will start from the beginning. But this is a very complex use case and it's not implemented on all browsers. And finally, I wanted to give a shout out to a point by the creator of HTMX, that is stability as a feature. HTMX is trying to maintain itself the same from now on, so that all projects using it will not need a lot of maintenance or no maintenance at all, and work the same way as they work now in 5, 10, 15 years, which for some projects might be a relief. So thank you for listening and have a great DjangoCon.
Thanks for the talk. You said that you could do almost every application with HTMX whatsoever. Let's say your task would be to write a date range picker. Would you use HTMX or some other technology?
For a date range picker?
Date range picker.
I'll probably use Alpine.js for that. I'll probably use Alpine.js for that.
Okay.
It seems to have very little logic. It might have some tricky edge cases, but mostly with a few statements and some clever JavaScript, I think it would be a good option.
Thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it. Around the question of building going back to the views and loading a bunch of partials, can you give me any warm, fuzzy feeling that this is not going to end up with loading it and having a spinner and a spinner and a spinner that you have to wait for? Like, is it faster in your experience than you see with the JavaScript things? There's so many things I use nowadays, these spinners, and all I see is
if you have a lot of backgrounds, so let's say heavy load on databases, it's going to have some spinners, right? But from my experience here, I've seen a lot of front-end applications where you get the data and it's still rendering and it still has a lot of spinners or shadow transitions. So I end up, it's more of like scale fast. Okay. But with caching and other tricks, it can be improved, or combining views into one if it's a common used page.
Okay, I like HTMX when everything is on the same server, but what about if the data are on another site and you have to fetch them? I tried it and it worked, but it really felt clunky because you always have to adapt the URLs. Or do we have any trick how that can be made easier?
So you're talking about fetching directly on the template from another
website, from another Django project. Both are Django projects, but we have to display it on one CMS website, but the data
you're giving me
website. And
iframe nightmares. I never had to do something like that, but
in the end, I thought Svelte is better. I did a similar project.
When I need to resort to front-end frameworks, I usually go with Svelte to build wrappers or small web components.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. When we're talking about the code base size itself, when you compare the same app using Django and HTMX versus Django, let's say React, do we tend to write a lot more code with HTMX?
You'll tend to write a lot more Python, but even if you add the Python, in my previous use cases, we've tested the LOCs and ends up being way smaller than having the React and the DRF. But you tend to write more Python, a lot more, yeah.
Do you have a link to the slides? Because they contain quite a good...
I can share after the talk.
Okay,
yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have more like a business kind of question. How do you find clients? Because HTMX is like 3-4 years old or something. And how do you find like clients?
In freelance, usually in freelance jobs, I had the choice of being able to use HTMX. In work, I guess I've been lucky. And I've always worked at small companies, so small teams, even if their products are huge. And there was an option, I think, or a use case that most people, I think, might come one day, is that front end takes a lot of time and we need an alternative. And I always have had that luck, I guess, to end up on places where I could use HTMX.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I know that you can use template partials inline rendering. So how complex is to get the SEO right in this case? I know that you've been talking a lot about rendering dashboards and everything, but for simple pages, well, that can get not simple in the long run.
So we're talking about template partials?
How complex, in your experience, was actually using inline rendering?
Inline rendering?
Yeah, of template partials.
Because it's just like I showed it. You have an endpoint, you delimit what you want to show with it, and HTMX loads the partial by loading it inline. So it's just that.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I just have one question regarding HTMX. Is it possible to swap multiple things at once with out-of-band swaps? Because when I tried it a few years ago, it was only possible to swap one additional thing by ID, right?
Yes, it's out-of-band swaps. It's a feature from HTMX that allows you to swap not only the main target, but other elements inside your response.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, how do you know when to actually escape into React or Svelte for web components?
When you have a lot of client-side state, even when using low overhead libraries such as Alpine, when you have a lot of moving parts, when you need proper state management, you see that the UI is becoming clunky, then it's when you scale it to a front-end tooling.
Thank you, Lucas, for your presentation.